Hello everyone, we want to look at how to do sine and cosine tangent when you're trying to find a missing angle, and that's what in my class we've been focusing on up until this point. So you had an angle of reference that you were looking for, and then you may have had two other numbers, or you may have had all three, and when you have all three you can use sine, cosine, or tangent. We learned the mnemonic SOHCAHTOA to help us remember the ratios. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. So now that we're familiar with those, when we do have a problem and they don't tell you which one to use, you're going to be able to figure out which one you could use on your own, in your own way. So let me put some numbers here. First thing we said and we learned how to do in my class is we label. So I always like to label the hypotenuse first. Okay, then opposite of the angle x. And then the leftover one is the adjacent, which means it's next to the angle x, but it's not the hypotenuse. So really adjacent is next to and touching the angle that we're using. So after we've done that, we can look at the two that we have. We only have two numbers. We're using the hypotenuse and the adjacent. So when we look at that, we can see adjacent and hypotenuse are the A and the H. When I look at sine or cosine and tangent, which one uses the adjacent and hypotenuse? And when we write this quickly, it'll help us to see that it's cosine, adjacent and hypotenuse, ka. So what we do is we say cosine of the angle always goes there, equals the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. Now the step we were going to get into now is using our calculator. And the main thing that's important is understanding the algebra aspect of this and how we would get x and separate x to solve and get x alone, solve for x. And we always have an angle here, and when it was a number we could put that directly into the calculator, but when it's not, we're going to have to use the inverse cosine. And the way I remember that is through the algebra portion. In order to separate the cosine from the variable, we're going to have to do the opposite, or the inverse cosine. And the inverse, or they also call it the arc cosine, is just the opposite. It's really like cosine of x. We're multiplying it by 1 over cosine and canceling it out. That's really what is happening there. So that as that cancels out and we now have x by itself, this tells us exactly what to put in a calculator, 18 out of 23. Okay, and a lot of times we'll use a decimal, 18 divided by 23. And we use the first four decimals, 7826. And by doing this, we got x by itself. We solved for x. And this tells us exactly what to put in the calculator. We're going to have to put cosine -1, or the inverse cosine. And then this decimal, and that'll give us the actual degree. So when you open your calculator, and you have 7826, let me just change that. What you're going to need to do is, if you push sine or cosine or tangent now, it wouldn't work right. What we need to do is push the inverse. So some of you have the calculator like this, is like the iPhone. You push the second button, it's like the shift. And when you see that, when you do that, you'll see cosine -1, sine -1, tangent -1. Those are the inverse. So I'm going to use cosine inverse, and it gives you 38.5. And we usually round to the nearest whole number, so 38.5 would round to 39 degrees. Because it's 5 or greater, we round up. So the main thing here is, number one, how to set up and label, and then number two, which button we're going to use in the calculator. We're going to use the inverse when we're trying to separate that x from the word sine or cosine or tangent. So let's try one more. And we could even change the direction or the location. We could put the x on the top. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll label our hypotenuse. And then we'll label opposite of our reference angle. Opposite of that would be 38. And our adjacent is the one left over. So looking at that and looking at the three things we use to remember, SO, CA, and TOA, if you were to highlight, we could see we're using the adjacent has a number and the opposite has a number. Adjacent and opposite is tangent. Adjacent and opposite. So we're going to set that proportion up. Tangent of the angle always goes next to the word tangent or sine or cosine. Is going to equal our opposite divided by our adjacent. So let's turn that into a decimal first. We'll see how it works in that case. 0.38. I'm sorry, 3.8. So again, the way I always remember, and I wish I knew this in high school, the way I can remember which button to use is I want to do the algebra portion. To separate tangent, I have to do inverse tangent. This separates the x from the word tangent and gets you x by itself. Self solves for x, which is what our goal is. And this will get us the degrees we would like in our calculator. So let's use the calculator on Google for a moment. And we'll see how that one works. So tangent inverse 3.8. So we want to make sure one thing is that it's turned to degrees. That's something that I wish they did automatically on Google. So change it to degrees. And we're going to push 3.8. Okay, why is this not going to come up? I guess we'll push the sine and cosine first. So we want to get the inverse. We're going to have to use the shift button, and I don't see it here, or the arc button. Let me try Google's calculator. Okay, so this will be easier to do. So again, we want to make sure it's set to degrees. Your calculators usually have it set to degrees on your phone. So that's one thing we needed to make sure we do, is set it to degrees. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to enter 3.8. Well, actually, we'll put it the way it's written. So as we look here, we see sine and cosine and tangent, but we don't want that. We want the inverse. I'm going to click the inverse button. So on your iPhone, it was the second or shift button. So the inverse sometimes is the other way it'll show up. Instead of the second button, it'll be the inverse. So I'm going to click, what did we have? Tangent, 3.8. Inverse of tangent, 3.8. And you'll see it's written arctangent. It means the same thing as the inverse tangent. 75 degrees. So again, we set up and label. We decide which one we're using, sine or cosine or tangent. And when we want to separate that x variable from the word sine or cosine or tangent, we're going to use the second button on your calculator or the inverse on other calculators. This will give us the inverse sine or cosine or tangent, the one with the -1 next to it. So that's a brief description of how we would set this up. Let's say we just had a problem like the beginning ones in your homework where it says tangent of x equals 0.38. So this has already been solved and set up for us, right? The only thing we need to do is get x by itself. I'm going to inverse both sides, and that will cancel out the word tangent, and now I have my x by itself. And this will be exactly what I put into my calculator, 3824, which is very much the same degrees that we just found. We just found 0.38 a minute ago. Oh no, we did 3.8. So let's try it. 3824. So again, I'll start over. I'll pretend I just got here. I need to change it to degrees. I'm going to click inverse tangent 0.3824. When I get that, I have 20.9 or 21 degrees. So later on we're going to see, there will be some times that you have this, tangent of 28 degrees equals x, and there are other times you're going to have this. So again, this we already have the number here, so we'll just type that right in the calculator, tangent of 28. There's no inverse, there's no separating, because x is already by itself. Here on the second example, we do need to inverse it on both sides, and that is what separates the x variable and gets x by itself. And this is exactly what we put in the calculator, the inverse tangent. So this first example already had the x by itself, so I didn't need to do the inverse to separate it. And we'll get more into this type in my class as we go. So we've been focusing on looking for an angle and doing the inverse first. So hopefully this helps. Have a good day.